Hey there, sports psych enthusiasts. I'm Dr. Colin Fehr, and I want to share my passion with you. I love talking about ways to unleash the power of the mind. This recording is part of a larger lecture series I've created in an effort to make sports psychology concepts more accessible to a larger audience. The information contained in this series is especially well suited for students of sports psychology and is presented in a way that makes for easy listening for all. Welcome to Sports Psych Concepts.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me for another Sports Psych Concepts presentation. Today, I want to talk about something that I have shared a bit about in some other presentations or recordings that I put together, but I wanted to really narrow this down a little bit more, right? I've expanded on it and talked about it in different places, and I just want to hone in on one particular piece of how to actually create a mental skills training or psychological skills training program, and some of the main considerations that we need to take into account when doing that. So I'm going to give you some guidelines for this, some main considerations. Like I said, I don't know that I'll give you, a complete roadmap, but I'm hoping that I can give you enough perspective on this that you understand what goes into this and everything involved in the process. So that's my goal for this presentation. So what I want to start out with is something that I've mentioned elsewhere that I want to reiterate here, is that there's many models out there for mental skills training that we can choose from, or that we can pattern our own programs after. And that's kind of a beautiful thing, because you can kind of mishmash and take one from one model and another from another and put things together and have more of an integrative approach, or you can take some from others and create your own and put it together that way. That's what I've done in my own experience. It took me really about 5 years to come up with my own model, and so there's ways that you can do that, okay? But I just want to mention, again, that you have a lot to choose from. So it can be just, sort of classic psychological skills training that you'll see in sports psychology service delivery, different models with that, cognitive behavioral approaches, the individual zones of optimal functioning, and how we get someone just to achieve their individual zone state. There's the resonance performance model, life development intervention model, thinking about things like that. And then there's also programs that are based on mindfulness, and some that are even linked to acceptance commitment therapy ideas, where they're diffusing from their thoughts or connecting with their values, and then they're taking effective action, those sorts of things, where the goal is to teach psychological flexibility, which essentially that's just the ability to act effectively in line with your personal values despite interfering or disruptive internal states, okay, is the idea there. So again, you have those, you have some broad categories to choose from, more traditional models, and you have mindfulness approaches, and again, overall, whatever it is, we're trying to teach mental techniques that then athletes or performers can apply and use during training and competition. So when we're choosing what our approach is, if it's mindful acceptance interventions or as traditional psychological skills training, we just need to consider what our goals are, what it is we're trying to accomplish. Of course, it'd be awesome if everything we did was based in empirical evidence, and so at least we want it to be informed by the empirical evidence, okay, evidence informed, right? There's a difference between evidence-based and evidence informed, and so we can use both of those and kind of come up with whatever our approach is. But certainly, if you're, we don't want to be using all of these different experimental things that we're just totally making up. We do want it to be informed by what's in the literature and the evidence is there. But if you listen to my presentation on the efficacy of mental skills training and does it actually work, you realize that there's limitations to that, okay? But we should also consider, our theoretical orientation and components and what that might mean for our performers, our personal approach. What training do we have? If we don't have training in particular frameworks, and maybe we shouldn't use those, different experiences. But the main thing I'm wanting to mention right here is just there's many models out there to choose from. We want to go and dig and read about them and make sure that we're informed. We practice, we get mentorship, we get supervision and feedback from more experienced practitioners, and then certainly from our clients. We want feedback from them and how things are going and how we might adjust things and make things better. And as long as we're keeping our client's best interest in mind as our primary objective, and the types of things we're wanting to accomplish, then we're going to be in good shape regardless of the approach that we use. So with that as our backdrop, what are some other guiding principles that we can think about? Again, so I'll primarily use in this presentation the sort of contrast between mindfulness acceptance type of approaches and just traditional psychological skills training that might be more cognitive behavioral, for example, right? Because there's just some good contrast there. But both of these approaches were designed with the goal of maximizing behavioral change, right? Getting the person to change it's essentially become a different person. I mean, that's the idea. That's the goal. Everything that it is we're doing is, no, we want to become different. We want to become better. We want to improve. And so that's really kind of the foundational principle. But there's some other principles that we can consider here, right? I mean, the goal is we want to create a learning space. We're trying to support processing and learning of whatever the content is that we're presenting. If it's a workshop, maybe there's a mix of some psychoeducation things or some drills or exercises. Definitely want to have some discussion and reflection. You could bring in visuals and things like imagery, and certainly repetition, right? In order to learn those mental skills, we got to treat them like physical skills. There's got to be repetition. It can't be one and done things. So we want to create a learning space. We want to make sure that we're paying attention to motivation. We want to strengthen their motivation to engage. If you're listening and you've actually worked with some athletes or groups of athletes, you'll find that there's various levels of motivation to engage in the process and what it is that you're doing. I have some teams that I've worked with where there certainly was the gamut, and that's one of the first things that I do is actually try to strengthen their motivation to engage, give them reasons to engage in the process and connect to what it is we're doing. And so part of that is, identifying meaningful goals, or you can use just quotes or motivation sentences, different ways you can describe that, phrases that will that will link them in. But ultimately it's about establishing personal relevance for the athlete or the performer. The relevance piece is key. Engagement, you want engagement, you got to make it relevant, so then they're actually motivated to engage. Okay, so we want to create a learning space. We got to pay attention to motivation, and then we want to promote regular practice of the types of exercises that we're doing. So just think about goal setting. Okay, so most performers, teams in athletic contexts, they set goals at the beginning of the season. And it's a one and done exercise. There's no tracking, there's no revisiting, no talking about it beyond that. It's just coaches know they should set goals, and so they kind of do that. But then that doesn't really end up being the guiding light for everything else that it is that they do. And so if we want them to actually buy into that fully, we should do set goals at the beginning of the season and do those sessions, but then we should also create a common thread throughout the rest of the season and everything else they're doing. So we could help them, just as an example, set practice goals. So not only do they have the overall goals for the season, but then, all right, based on those goals, what are your goals for practice today? And they set those goals every single practice before they go out there. So they have an objective, they have a clear target. Okay, so that's just one example, but we want to encourage practice. Okay, so that could also include, things like discussing barriers and solutions, or things that were faced, reflections after practice. You could provide things like, if it's imagery, it could be audio files. So it's not just like they only do imagery when they meet with the mental performance consultant, but they actually get to do it outside on their own time. So that can be really good. So encouraging practice is a big one. And then, so the last one that I'll mention here is just, we want we want to reactivate the content between meetings, between sessions, between workshops. We want there to be some scaffolding between those things so it's linked. So one of the main weaknesses that I've seen of aspiring mental performance consultants when they put together a psychological skills training program is that it's just too convenient. They're like, okay, we're going to do an 8-week session and we're going to meet once a week for those 8 weeks. And so the first week we're going to do goal setting, and the next week we're going to do imagery, and the next week we're going to do a self-talk or concentration or whatever, right? And they go through all of the different skills, and there's no continuity between any of that. Okay, there's no connection with what they did the first time. And there has to be, right? It's a repetition piece. We have to scaffold and build things on each other and link everything it is together. So that puts it in context. And again, that's the relevance piece. Everything, it can't be totally compartmentalized where it stands alone, and it's just a one and done deal, as I mentioned. And so, ways that you can do this. I think it's great to assign homework, things for them to do and bring back for the next practice to talk about or reflect on. There's different apps that teams use to communicate with each other, just sending text messages or emails or whatever through the app, and so using those tools to keep that continuity and scaffold everything and link everything together is really, really, really important. Okay, so we have those guiding principles. Just to rehash, we're creating a learning space. We're paying attention to motivation by making everything relevant. We're encouraging practice so they get repetition, and then we're scaffolding and linking everything between sessions so it's not compartmentalized and standalone. So if we do these things, we're going to support those behavioral changes that we want, that then ultimately may contribute to well, for one, the attractiveness of the program and what it is that we're doing if we're just talking about the mental skills component, but also enhancing performance, because that's something that the performers are going to be interested in. And so with those guiding principles as the backdrop, then one of the next steps is to identify the possible skills and techniques that we want to use or integrate and build within what our program is, if there's different workshops that we're doing, and tying those things together. Okay, and I've mentioned these things in different presentations. Obviously there's a difference between skills and techniques, right? The skills are the end outcome of what it is that we want, and the techniques are the things that lead to those things. Okay, so I have different lists of them, and sometimes they're separate and sometimes they're together, and all of that, but it's important to understand the difference between those things. But different techniques, those are things like our energy management, right, or imagery or self-talk, or things like goal setting. And so the workshops that we'll put together, we might focus on these things sequentially, and again, we want to scaffold and link them together, and the types of things that we're trying to accomplish with these techniques, and whatever the skill is that we're aiming at. That, for example, goal setting could be to actually build some motivation. Motivation is the skill and the experience that they're having on that, and so how we construct our goals can help determine what the motivation is, whether it's more intrinsic or extrinsic, right? Or we could have imagery where we're trying to build confidence, or even attentional focus could be a skill that's off of that. Okay, so many different things there, but we have the techniques to choose from, and if we're looking at this again from the perspective, the contrasting perspective between traditional psychological skills training and maybe more of a mindfulness acceptance approach, the things that we target may be a little bit different. So if we're using mindfulness acceptance approaches, a technique might be diffusion, right? Diffusion, where we're distancing ourselves from our inner states or thoughts or things that we're experiencing, or just acceptance, where we're willing to endure unpleasant, both unpleasant and pleasant internal states. Okay, and so you could focus your workshop or your program a little bit differently depending on what your approach is there, right? So like I said, traditional psychological skills training, you might have goal setting and imagery and self-talk, and you do those things in order and you link them. And then if it's more mindfulness, you might have, well, let's focus on just awareness of the present moment situation, and then we work on diffusion, and then acceptance, and we have some repetition, right, or value clarification. So there's just different things involved in that. But like I said, the main thing to understand is there's other models out there. You can categorize the skills and the techniques differently, but the main thing is that it's important to understand which ones lead to which, right? If we're choosing a particular technique, what is the actual skill that follows? Or it really should go in the other direction. What skill are we trying to develop, and then what techniques will lead to that optimally? And then we can say, well, is it a more traditional technique, or we're going to go more mindfulness acceptance direction? Okay, so it just illustrates how complex this can be and how sophisticated it can be, but then also that's really kind of the fun part when you're putting it all together. So then when we're actually looking at structuring the program, there's a lot of different ways that we can do this. We can have a certain number of sessions. They're 60 minutes long, or 30 minutes long, it's 90 minutes long, whatever it is, or the period of a month, or the period of 2 months, the duration of the season, right? Ideally, we want it to, ideally you want to have as many sessions as you can to build in there. There should be an ongoing thing. And that's going to be the best possible thing. However, if you're an independent consultant and say you're just basically doing contract work with different teams or clubs, then you may say, okay, well, so you have an 8-week season coming up, and I'm willing to come and work with the teams, and once a week go through and do these different things and give them some homework and drills that they can do in between. What do you say, right? And there still can be some effectiveness with that, because most of the time the access that a mental performance consultant is going to have, it isn't going to be totally unfettered. You're not going to have complete access and just get to do whatever it is you want. You're going to have to fit within the confines of what the coach or the administrator is going to allow for you. Okay, so ideally, we want to. Well, I guess what I wanted to say here is the best time to start a psychological skills training program is usually in the off season or the preseason. Okay, that was the point. So you can choose what your overall structure is going to be, how long it's going to be, all those sorts of things. But generally, you don't want to come in with your program where, okay, now they're in the thick of the competitive season and they're almost to the postseason, and now we're going to introduce these new things, these new skills, these new parts of their routine. That's not the best time to do that. It's not that there aren't ways that you could still come in and complement what's going on and have some added value there at those times. It's kind of interesting because I've had many coaches recruit me at those times in the season because they're like, oh, hey, it's important, we need to do this stuff, and I've still gone and done that work, but I've been very careful about how I've structured the program, because the best time to do it is in the off season or preseason, where they can play around with it, they can make mistakes. There's not really a lot of pressure for them to try what they're doing. They don't have the intensity or duration of their training that they're experiencing, and so that can be a great time to do it. Okay, and so if we look at the length of the program, I've talked about this a little bit, 3 to 6 months, however long we can fit it in there, what it is that we can do, but we do want continuity. It's really important. And within that, it has to be systematic. Okay, there has to be some practice or some drills or some things that you're doing with the performers. So for example, I've done plenty of psychoeducational chats or talks with teams where you basically give a presentation. And there's value in that. It gets them to think, and there can be some reflection, but it doesn't necessarily translate to skills unless you actually implement a technique and make them work on some of those skills and develop them and struggle with them. So you want to make it systematic in the sense that you're incorporating drills and exercises and ways for them to engage and wrestle with the concepts and work on those skills. Okay, and you want this to happen, as I said, like we talk about, well, what's a program, how long it should be, 3 to 6 months, 4 months, 4 times 8 sessions, however it is. But mental training should continue as long as an athlete's participating in their sport. As long as a performer's doing their thing, they should be doing mental training. Okay, so that's the way to look at this, is like we can develop some good stuff and have a sweet little program that we put together and go do in 8 sessions, and we share these things, and it's interesting and invigorating for them. But really, we want continuity. We want long term. Okay, and so we structure our program around these guidelines, but then we keep that in the back of our mind always. All right, so another concept I want to talk about a little bit more deeply, because I know that I alluded to it earlier, is assessment. And really the assessment is driving, or should drive, the entire program, because this is, well, what are the needs of the individual athletes, the group, the coaches, the whoever the stakeholders are that we're working with, what do they actually need? We don't want to assume that we can come in and share with them what it is they need. And this is interesting, because this is part of the entrepreneurial side of mental performance. Is there's some practitioners that will create pre-packaged programs, and they just have this program that they can come and say, hey coach, I've got this program, 8 different sessions, I'll come in and deliver it to your team once a week for these 8 weeks, and this is how much it'll cost you, right? And the coaches look at it and say, oh, hey, great. And there's benefit in those things. Absolutely, there's benefit in those things, okay? But it's based on the assumption that you can just standardize what it is that you're doing. And there's certain standard principles and guidelines that should apply to every situation. And obviously the skills there's going to be overlap in every situation and all of that. There's universal skills. And so I'm certainly not saying that, but an ideal program is driven by the assessment, where we actually determine what the needs are, and then we create the program, we customize the program around those sorts of things. Okay, so this is a crucial step in determining what the athlete's psychological strengths and weaknesses are. I mean, we're really trying to identify the skills that might be deficient or negatively affecting their performance. That's a big part of this. Okay, so assessment procedures, when we think about how to actually do this, it can include things like an oral interview. That can be super useful, where you're just asking them questions and reflecting and talking to them. Now, we don't want that to turn into an interrogation, but it can be really helpful to read their body language and how they're describing things, and the feedback that you get from that is very useful. And then we can use formal psychological inventories. Okay, there's so many of them out there that focus on different things. We're trying to assess confidence. You could look at one to assess growth mindset, or just a variety of different mental skills. It could be stress and coping skills. I mean, there's so many different tools available for that, and those all can be useful. Okay, so you can use those inventories, you can do interviews, and then you can use behavioral observation, where you go to their practice or you go to their competition and you watch them perform. That's been very intriguing for me and in my experience. And then you can sort of triangulate that with input that you get from other experts, the coaches or athletic trainers. I think about most of the referrals that I get, they come from athletic trainers, actually injured athletes. And so that's usually the first bit of input I get on an athlete in terms of assessment. But so you have all of those things available, and I want to mention one specific tool, and that is performance profiling. Some consider this to be kind of an alternative approach, but in reality, it's very useful, because we aren't coming at the athletes as if we already know what skills that they need. Okay, it's the other way. We're flipping the script, where the athletes are the ones who identify the skills that they need, and then they rate those skills. Now, it's important to mention here that if you're working with younger athletes, say high school athletes, youth athletes, they may not know how to articulate this and define the terms. And so you could give them a list. Say if you want them to come up with 8 skills that are important, they think are most important, and they're going to rate those. Maybe you give them a list of 10 or 12, and they have to choose from that list, right? So you're kind of giving them a pool to choose from, but you're not just saying, well, here's the 8 skills that you need, now rank yourself on these, right? So they're still involved in that process. It's really cool, because it makes it's more subjective, but at the same time it's subjective in the best possible way, because they're identifying what's important to them, and then they rate themselves on those things. Okay, and so this is a wonderful thing, because if we're working in groups, even, you still can do this, because a lot of group programs, they tend to be standardized. Like I said, we come in and here's our pre-packaged program, and this is what we're going to deliver, right? And that can be useful, certainly, but the more efforts that we can make to individualize the content of our program and the exercises that we're doing as much as possible are that's really, really beneficial. It's a great way to go about it. And even if we're working in the group setting, if we can somehow do individual sessions to complement that, to coincide with that, that can be really, really beneficial. Okay, so I can't I can't overstate the importance of the assessment. And we've mostly talked about it in a psychological perspective, but if you're working with athletes in a sport that you don't really know that much about, you also need to determine the demands of the specific sport and analyze that and consider how that might factor into your program. Okay, and then with the information that you get from the assessment and the available time that you have and commitment, then you will prioritize which psychological skills you're going to emphasize in the program. So again, if you do performance profiling and an athlete says, well, here's the 8 skills that I think are the most important, and then here's the top 3 that I want to work on. Like, they can do that for you, right? They make it simple. Say, okay, these are the ones that you're weakest on. Let's target these. Let's start with the one that you rated yourself the lowest on and build on that. Okay, so assessment is really, really important if you can't tell how I'm stressing it so much. So once we've got, the assessment information, then we need to, really it's almost like taking a step back to look and say, well, what is the role of the mental performance consultant, the sports psychology expert? And, ideally, when it comes to mental skills training programs, you want that to be conducted by a qualified practitioner. They should be the one to plan it, to implement it, and then supervise the program. Now, that's not always practical because there's not very many of those practitioners. And so there's ways that you can still get that information out and share that with athletes by enlisting the help of other people who have more contact with the athletes. So coaches in particular, they can certainly effectively deliver psychological training, especially if there's, say budgetary constraints or the mental performance consultant isn't always available for them. There certainly can be positive effects when coaches are delivering the training. Okay, now if this is the case, you still want the mental performance consultant who's the specialist to be involved in that. Okay, maybe supervising it and discussing and talking about things and how the coach can implement those things. Okay, and if it is the other way around where the mental performance consultant does have time, we still want the coaches to attend those sessions and show support for that and make sure that they're the athletes are applying that effectively during practice and competition, because again, the coaches are going to be there more. They have more contact and touch points with that. Okay, so the role of the mental performance consultant can encapsulate those things, but one of the key things that'll determine the effectiveness of the interventions is that practitioner develops rapport. They establish presence with their athletes. And a big part of this is simply just being there, like showing face, but then also finding ways to connection. There was this college basketball team that I worked with once where, I attended a lot of practices and went to some games and did some workshops with the team. And so much of what it is I did every day was built on just establishing presence. I didn't just walk in the gym and go stand on the other side. I went in the gym and I connected and did fist bumps, high fives with every single player on the team. And I did it every single time that I walked in the door. They knew it was coming. And so there was that presence and that eye contact and that connection. And then you had that rapport. So it's not just the presence of being in the space, right? Establishing presence is so much more than that to build trust and respect and a partnership. Okay. And so if we do all of those things, it'll lead to more effective programs in what it is that we're doing. And so it's really important to establish that role early. Okay, so now I just have a couple more, as we transition, I just have a couple more things that I want to mention today. And the next is like, okay, we've done our assessment. We kind of know what the needs are. We've established our role, and now we actually want to find ways to implement these skills, right? How are we going to implement it? And what I want to focus on here is integrating those skills into the actual competition setting. Okay, so there's lots of ways you can go about psychological skills training, workshop things. I've had lots of talks in the locker room. I've had talks in conference rooms. I've had talks in classrooms, right? I've had talks on the golf course. I've had talks in the basketball gym, like all the different places, right? It can look a lot of different ways, and so we can do all that, and that matters. But once the psychological skills are learned, we want the athletes to be integrating those with their physical skills practices and really link that to their performance, right? That should be the specific focus. And so part of this is identifying which times or performance times they need to be practicing those skills. So again, it can't happen in isolation in what we're doing when we're working with them. We want to integrate it and make that connection for them in their mind, but then also in the actual context. Okay, and so some different ways that we can do this specifically is use things like pre-competition and competition plans. Okay, so you use these to help those athletes. They get themselves ready physically and mentally, and it just creates that ideal performance state. That's what we're all about. Okay, and so part of that is establishing consistent routines that take into account both external and internal factors. Okay, so this is a big thing. I remember one of my college coaches said, well, the reason that I want you to engage in this routine and do it every time is because it helps you know what to think about. It connects you with the right things to think about, the things that we've talked about previously building up to this point. And so then you're not spending your time thinking about other things and worrying and all about things that are really irrelevant and are not helping you to perform. Okay, so those pre-competition plans on what it is we're going to do, it gives us something to focus on. We build in these anchor and cue words and things that we're saying to ourselves that get us in the right state of mind. And we're also, we're preparing ourselves physically along that same time. Okay, then you have competition plans and how you respond and in certain situations. So, an example would be a basketball player and in they're shooting free throws and they miss the first free throw. What's their plan and how they're going to respond to that? What are they going to say to themselves? What routine are they going to use to get back into an ideal mental state so they increase the chances of making the next free throw? Okay, so that would be an example there. Now, you also could say that that's a refocusing plan, okay? Because there's different ways you can scaffold this. You have pre-competition plans, competition plans, and then you have refocusing plans, which could be things that just are rituals that a lot of athletes use when there's a transition. So baseball players sometimes they transition from the outfield back to the dugout, right? And then they're going to go up to bat and then these different things. So they might have a refocusing plan, but you could make it even more specific than that and just say, well, when an athlete makes a mistake, how are they going to refocus? What plan do they have to deal with either an external or internal distraction? Okay, and so part of this is just identifying what those distractions are and how we usually respond to that, and then say, well, what's our preferred response? And what can we do? What can be part of our refocusing plan to remind ourselves? Okay, so a mistake ritual, there's all sorts of examples out there, but it can help athletes deal with the errors or mistakes that they make quickly and then refocus on the next action. Okay, so a lot of times athletes are saying next one, next play, next ball, right? They make a mistake, they say flush it down the toilet, right? Forget it, whatever. So sometimes it can be a phrase like that. It can be different cues, different things that they do can be a part of it. And so there's a lot of options there, but however it is that we're doing it, right? The broader point here is we want to integrate those mental skills into the proper context as soon as we can. And so with all of that, the last thought that I have to share is about evaluating our program. Okay, we put it together. We consider all of the different things that we need to, that are our guiding principles and how we might structure it with the time constraints. We assess the program. We assess what the needs are, right? Different ways that we can do that. We establish our role, and then we implement our workshops and find ways to integrate those skills within the proper context. And then the last step is, well, to determine whether what we did actually made a difference. And this can be really hard, right? To gauge the effectiveness and make modifications on this, because it can be hard to determine, make a clear connection between what it is we did and the actual performance result. And so sometimes we may not even be trying to make that connection between the performance result. It might just be, well, where is the athlete's motivation? Where is their self-efficacy or their confidence, right? Those sorts of things. Where is their self-talk at now compared to where it was before? And we can rate those things and track those, even though it may not necessarily lead to a particular outcome, right? More wins than losses, because that's not totally within their control. Okay, but so we're evaluating the program itself and whether we achieved our stated objectives. Okay, so ideally, you want a formal, total, complete evaluation that's happening at the end. You want to use both subjective reports and objective performance data if we can, and try and make those connections. It's always good to do that. We definitely should ask our participants for feedback on what went well, what didn't really work well, what suggestions they have for improvement. That can be really, really valuable. And I should also mention that, there's different ethical considerations in the realm of sports psychology that always should be the guiding principles. Okay, and so we need to know these things. Did everything that we do is ethical? Did we adhere to ethical standards? Did we respect the dignity and worth of the individuals? Did we respect confidentiality? Did we recognize limits of our own competency? Were there instances where we needed to make referrals, right? People who have different unique backgrounds, did we take that into consideration? There's so many different things, okay? So the athlete's welfare is at the forefront, okay? And there's different certification bodies and governing bodies out there, like the Association for Applied Sports Psychology that has ethics codes. American Psychological Association has ethics codes, and a division that specifically is dedicated to sports psychology. So that's definitely another consideration that sometimes can be overlooked when really it shouldn't. That should be the guiding light for everything that a practitioner does, is to make sure that what we're doing is ethical. Okay, so to bring it full circle, right? We go through all of those different steps to create our program, and I gave you some general guidelines as well as a few specific things, but you get to fill in the rest of the blanks. But we always want to evaluate it. We want to get better every time we do a program, and if we're not evaluating and really asking the questions of what we can do better, then we aren't going to be improving, and we're not going to be living up to the things that we're trying to get our athletes to do. Okay, so the evaluation is a key component. So with that, that's all I have for this presentation. Appreciate you taking the time to listen. Hopefully you learned some stuff, and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for listening to this recording in the Sports Psych Lecture Series. I hope you learned something. More importantly, I hope you learned something that you can apply in your life. Feel free to share this presentation with others who might be interested. And if you're interested in more content like this, visit the Fehr Advantage channel on YouTube, or find the Fehr Advantage podcast on Spotify, or visit my website at fehradvantage.com.